So the format is I'd like to introduce some of the big trends in the work that I do, and then give you a couple frameworks about how to think about cities and some points of inflection in investing in cities in the emerging world. Give a couple examples, then a couple places where I think that technology can be exported, and then hear from you. So I'm happy to see what people have for questions, and it may be something where you can interact with each other in that regard. So a little background on me. I'm from industry. Before I came to Harvard, I ran a real estate and construction company. But what I teach now I came to Harvard to teach real estate, but now I teach a course called Building Sustainable Cities and Infrastructure. And it's about a third an infrastructure and public-private partnership class, about a third economic development, and about a third what I call gadgets and gizmos and inventions, which is what you all do from the technology point of view. I also take students on travel courses. So 2 years ago, I took 40 students to Buenos Aires, Argentina, and Lima, Peru, to say, is it true that there's opportunities for private sector businesses to invest and operate public infrastructure like roads, bridges, water, power, transit? Last year, I took students to Africa. In 8 weeks, I'm taking 40 MBA students to Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, again, to look at infrastructure. So the three big trends that I try and address are, first, massive urbanization and the migration that Jeremy Grantham talked about, as hundreds of millions of people around the world move to cities, either seeking better economic opportunity from some nations or as refugees from others. The second is resource scarcity. Not enough clean air, not enough clean water, not enough power, not enough land, not enough food, too much garbage, and too much traffic. So my colleagues at the government school think, yep, the answer to that is just we'll have better government that makes long-view decisions to build infrastructure based on evidence that's well-financed, that follows consensus. Yeah, so okay, I hope the Easter Bunny brings consensus. But in the meantime, what can the private sector do? So for me, there's sort of three approaches to these problems of massive urbanization and resource scarcity. One is around infrastructure and finance. So you need to have roads, bridges, water, power, transit to be able to have economic development in these places and to be able to have jobs. You also need finance. Now it happens that now at this time there's 20 or 30 trillion with a T dollars, Bob Posey can talk about this more, of institutional capital floating around the global financial system. Well, last week it was earning 50 basis points, now it's earning 75 basis points, but still not very much. So there's a huge amount of capital for insurance companies, endowments, pension funds, sovereigns looking for yield. There's all this need for infrastructure, which are nice, long-dated assets. The infrastructure paradox is, how do we marry these things up? So to me, the approach to solving the paradox lives in cities. That's why we'll talk about cities and urbanization. Partly because cities are the political unit that can act. Mayors tend to be able to do a lot more, particularly around infrastructure and public-private partnerships. You can't really imagine a public-private partnership for roads at a federal level in Germany or the US or really anywhere bigger than Singapore. Cities also are the scale that investors get. Investors understand how to invest in a power plant or a toll road or a bridge or something like that. So that works out. And cities, of course, create a lot of energy and vitality. But when I think about cities and technology, I'm not necessarily thinking about like the cool stuff that we do as elites in Massachusetts. So if you're thinking about Boston or Copenhagen and bikes and Yelp, and technology is kind of a way for rich people to spend their disposable income a little better. I'm interested in how can we use some of these technologies for billions of people at the bottom of the pyramid on a investable kind of basis to improve their lives. So even though my course also includes what to do in London, it talks a lot about Jakarta, Mumbai, Sao Paulo, places like that. So that's sort of the approach. And I wanted to give you sort of three examples, not fancy technology for rich people, but technology to use out in the world. One's from water, one's from power, and one's from transit. So in the water space, as Jeremy said, there's plenty of water in the world. It's just of the wrong quality in the wrong place at the wrong time. So how do you figure out how to address this? So I wrote about a company called in India, in Ahmedabad, India, in Gujarat, called Sarvajal, which in Hindi means water for all. And they're interested in providing clean water in villages. These villages are never going to be reached by a big power plant. There's not going to be a plant. There's not going to be the horizontal distribution to get to them. And it would be nice to have small reverse osmosis machines that could serve 10 or 20 or 100 families. But this has always failed in the past because of the rural operations problem. A, nobody can afford a $5,000 reverse osmosis machine, and B, it gets cluttered up. The filters don't get changed, it gets stolen. What do you do? So this company, Sarbajal, elected to franchise out these water filtration machines, creating entrepreneurs who are franchisees but don't need to put the capital up. But the way they solve the rural operations problem is with technology. So there's an SMS messaging unit on the top of each of these units. At every minute, it says back to headquarters, here's where I'm located, here's how hot I am, here's the pressure drop across the membrane, here's the particulate content. And then even before Prime Minister Modi took all the big bills out of circulation, they said, we don't want to have a cash economy. We're going to have people top up a card to buy water, and they'll top the card up with their local kirana, their local shop. So what this allows them to do is keep the stuff working, provide businesses for entrepreneurs who otherwise need some other kind of job, take a lot of the cash leakage out of the system, and promote the best franchisees, because they know which ones do well, which ones are functioning well, so those people get another unit or another town, and the bad ones kind of go away. So they wind up promoting entrepreneurship, getting water to these people, but what broke the chain of the rural operations problem was the combination of finance, where they lease these things, and the SMS messaging on top. So to me, that's an interesting way to address water in the world. The second one I wanted to talk about is energy or power. And you have the same phenomenon in Africa or Latin America or India, where there isn't enough capacity to generate. The grid's not any good to transmit. The distribution mechanism isn't any good. And even if you were selling power to the grid might not be a credit-worthy off-taker. It'd be like if you're an independent power producer here and Eversource didn't pay its bills, maybe because the retail people don't pay their bills. So what do? So a company I taught a case about on Tuesday at Harvard Business School called Cross-Boundary Energy provides renewable energy directly to corporates, because this is in Ghana. They also work in Liberia, Kenya, Rwanda, because the grid isn't reliable enough. The corporates are losing a lot of money when the grid goes down, particularly if you're in a processing business that has kilns or ovens or something. The power goes out for half an hour. You have to power down your kilns and bring them back up. You're out of business for a day. And the corporates wind up buying diesel fuel. So they have diesel generators, which are expensive. They're really hard to run, and it's hard to get the fuel there. They would like to use wind or photovoltaics, but the corporates don't want to take the technology risk to figure it out, and they definitely don't want to capitalize it because it doesn't meet their hurdle rate to put an energy investment in place. So Cross-Boundary Energy has gathered global capital together to be a developer and owner of primarily photovoltaic sort of mini grids in the 5 megawatt to 20 megawatt range, selling directly to corporates. The corporates like this because they can get solar power for a fee and pay as you go, and they don't have to put it on their balance sheet. And they can get rid of the diesels, they can get rid of the difficulty of getting the fuel up there, and they can run their operations better. So can these guys scale up? Well, yeah, partly because they understand the technology, partly because they have a lot of learning and knowledge about what works in what place, partly because they can think about how to direct the capital investment into the equipment, and partly because they can think of best practices around vendors and all those things. So those are technology things also scaling up and avoiding the idea of going to the utility scale grid and selling direct to corporates and addressing a lot of the issues of emerging markets that way. The third one I wanted to mention is in transportation. And there are a number of really efficient bus rapid transit systems in the world. There are also some terrible ones. Like if you've been to Jakarta, the bus rapid transit system is basically a parking lot. But in Allahabad, India, or in Buenos Aires, or in Dar es Salaam, the bus rapid transit has been built in a way that people's commuting time drops from maybe 3 hours to an hour. You can get people out of their car and in the bus if they're going to get there 2 hours faster. It also winds up being something where you can coordinate who wants to ride the bus when based on the people's cell phone information. Like, wouldn't it be nice if the NBA did that? I rode the red line and the green line today already, and they don't exactly know what when their surges are going to be. This also leads to another benefit, particularly in property. So I'm a real estate guy, and if you put down a bus rapid transit lane that gets people to work 2 hours faster, instantly the value of the property goes up. You have a question of how do we capture that value? Does that value just inure to the landowner, or should it come back into the system? In the old days, you didn't really know how to track that. You'd hope the landowner's property taxes would go up. In the new days, you have a chance to track that with analytics and microprocessing. So I'm thinking to myself, Fidelity knows every 30 seconds what my portfolio is doing. You certainly can figure out where the investments went in the transit and get a cumulative benefit of these things being built together. So you can think of the real estate project, the road project, the water project, all having an assembled value that's greater than the parts alone, which is a new thing that you can figure out now with technology and software that talks about how to optimize these things together. So those are 3 examples of ways in which cities and urbanization can impact how people live in emerging markets. And they involve what I think are 3 different kinds of technologies. You probably have different categories in a trade association, but one of them is the Internet of Things, sensors, and big data. So the reason that the water project works in India is because of sensors and Internet of Things, sensors everywhere. So if you think about how to apply that more and more, then you can extend that into the emerging world and take a lot of the waste and foolishness and save carbon. The second is around optimization and cumulative benefit. So if you think about demand response in electricity, or what I described around the bus rapid transit, if you can think how to illustrate to people plan A is the old traffic system, plan B is the new traffic system, how are we going to pile up the benefit of these things? This is something we've never been able to do before, to model that, and it's a way to bring more capital into these kind of projects, particularly private capital who wants to think how to mitigate their risk. The third component, which I did not really talk about, which ties into the buses though, is around autonomous vehicles. And I'm sure you have a group here talking about autonomous vehicles. And we all think of autonomous vehicles as like, yeah, I want to put my feet up in my Tesla while I go from San Francisco to the peninsula and read the Wall Street Journal in the back of the seat. I think that's a decoy. The autonomous vehicles aren't going to change the life for you and me that much. Where they are going to change the life is in poor places or really congested places. And I'll give you 2 examples of poor places that are really different. One is Rochester, New York. I did a talk in Rochester in the spring. So Rochester used to be one of the great industrial cities in the US. They've lost half their population. People are really distributed around. And one of the problems they have is getting their lower income workforce to work. They don't own cars. They live all over the place. Rochester has to try and run buses all over everywhere. It's not hard for the city of Rochester to imagine Uber Pool plus autonomous vehicles to say, why don't we have a series of 8 or 10 passenger vans that knows where these people are, knows where they want to go, pool their needs, and bring them to work. We could get rid of our entire bus fleet and our entire metro fleet and help these people get to work and make it more attractive to have people come back to Rochester because it's beautiful, it's on a lake, we have low housing costs, let's get them out of the cities. So that was kind of counterintuitive for me, that it's not that they want to drive to New York faster, it's that they want to get people around their town and save those costs. The other place where autonomous vehicles to me will make a difference is in these really congested cities. So if you think of Mumbai or Jakarta or Sao Paulo or Lagos, it's really hard to move. People are in individual cars. Autonomous vehicles go through the intersections much faster than we do because they're smart. They don't have to wait and crash into each other, and they can hold more people. So you have the ability, if you have a 6 or 10 person passenger van that's autonomous, to carry 8 or 10 times the number of human beings on the same quantity of concrete and tarmac. So without having to make more investments in dirt and concrete, without having to take people's buildings, without having to do stuff, you can improve the flow of people. So I think it's likely that autonomous vehicles are going to make more difference in Jakarta and Mumbai than they're going to make in Cambridge or Palo Alto. So I've tried to assemble all these things in my class into it's kind of a big word, I need a better marketing title. The opportunities in the next decade for the private finance of public infrastructure in the so-called global south, in Latin America, Africa, India, and Southeast Asia, ex-China. So what I wanted to do is give you several of those thoughts around the kind of investments there might be, around infrastructure first approach, around the cities approach that's not around cool stuff for people in Copenhagen, but around things for the billions of people moving to cities in the world. And I'm really curious to know what you think. What's the opportunity? Where's there an obstacle? Did you run the numbers on the case study? Probably not. What do you think? Yeah?
So you had one case where you had a corporation that had dependency on diesel and other things and how they could have alternative solutions to their power needs. But there are a lot of infrastructure needs that nobody has the mandate and there's no solid return on investment. And so and the government just doesn't have money or it's ill managed. So what would be some creative ways to get some of the funding or people to feel empowered or invested, or philanthropic groups to feel like, this is a good place for us to step in and make some headway?
Well, we can come back to Phil. Give her the microphone back, please. No, let her keep it. Oh. We can keep it. We can think of philanthropic groups second. What do you think are the obstacles right now for global capital markets to invest in emerging market infrastructure? Why are they skittish about it today?
I think for my personal is that everybody is short-sighted and thinking, how am I going to see the return? Mm-hmm. And there's uncertainty and not a clear business case for the people who are making the investments to see that impact come back to them. Maybe okay. That's also narrow.
Somebody here wants to continue on, yeah?
Two big issues.
To the point of why are people skittish about, why is global capital nervous about emerging market infrastructure?
Yeah, I'm going to bring the particular perspective. My brother-in-law was one of the two founders of CellTel,
yep.
The Pan-African Cellular Network, which represents the largest single deployment of private capital for infrastructure in sub-Saharan Africa, billions of dollars. They had two issues: corruption and weak property rights.
Yep.
And those are, to the extent that they're the only private company to have successfully sued a state and won. So they end up at one point suing Tanzania over their because they put in several $1 billion, and then Tanzania basically set out to confiscate all of their assets because they felt like it. So, and over again, it's the reason why Mo Ibrahim, his founder, has created the Mo Ibrahim Foundation Prize.
So do you think there are ways in which some of these technologies we talked about all day today could address some of those issues? Start with low-level corruption. For example, if you imagine cashless payments and the ability to track where people are, you can take a lot of the low-level cash leakage out of the system. It's not clear to me how you can keep the turban vendor from paying the prime minister. Like the high-level corruption is difficult, but a lot of the transparency, accountability, and tracking that we talk about in technology should be available. So that's part of the hope, is that you can de-risk these. So you're basically saying the same thing. There's reasons why these projects aren't bankable because they're risky. And the hope, not necessarily proven, is that some of the things that we do here, that like Akamai or Wellington or Fidelity do to keep track of what's going on, can de-risk these projects in ways that people will get more comfortable investing in them. Then the second question about the nonprofits is that modern finance allows you to have different layers of investment, different levels of risk. So a lot of the nonprofits are willing to accept some lower level of return, maybe 1 or 2%, if they get the money back sometime, if that catalyzes everybody else. So you wind up having multiple layers there, and if you can get a sovereign behind that, as I'm sure that the telco company tried to do, then there's ways to bring in global capital also. That's hard to track in the old methodology of people faxing papers around and doing checks, but if you think about a newer methodology of cashless payments and good tracking of where the investment goes, then it's more plausible. And even like the World Bank and the IFC, International Financial Corporation, and African Development Bank, saying the investors are happier if they're investing directly in the asset and they can see like which piece of turban it bought, rather than put the money in this giant pool and have it get wasted someplace. So that's sort of the aspiration. Does it exist now? No. Might it exist in the next decade? Maybe. Is that responsive to the question? And was that your original question that you had your hand up for, or something else?
No, it was more responsive to that, because it's been the subject of family conversation, dinner table conversation for the last 15 years.
I bet. Because that's totally the holy grail, is how you can get this money into infrastructure. And cell infrastructure is much easier because once you have the tower up, the bits are replicable. You can put a lot of bits through the thing. And regular infrastructure with people and water and cars and trucks, those are atoms. Atoms aren't compressible. Atoms are heavy. So if you can move them around, there's much more benefit in the end. But if you're in the cell business, if you get fiber to the tower and the generators don't go out, you can get a lot more data through through the application. So the idea of technologies that move stuff as compared to technologies that move information are, to me, two really different ways to invest. Let's go to another spot. There's one over here.
So thank you for giving us this tremendous systems view on how all the interconnected systems work in cities. I'd love if you could continue to give us some creative ideas around your Rochester example. And clearly one thing that we noticed became quite apparent in this election is not so much party differences as much rural versus urban.
Yeah.
And sort of, yes, I understand technology to alleviate congestion and the cities that are already crowded, but what about the ones that have a lot more displacement because of technology? Are you seeing any kind of movement or creative, ideas that are starting to at least create some new economic value in those communities?
Sure. Let me push that back to you also. One would be to ask you, compare Rochester and New York City. Will autonomous vehicles make it more attractive to live in Rochester or less?
So I'm curious what happens after there's an autonomous vehicle network in the city. Like what kind of businesses or companies emerge as a result of? Like what other pain gets relieved because now there are autonomous vehicles, so that, these are just dynamic forces that play off one another. So just curious, what happens after the autonomous vehicle network?
Let me continue the other logic first. We don't know if actually autonomous vehicles makes it even easier for millennials to go to New York City, and there's going to be 30 million people in New York and Los Angeles and nobody in the Great Heartland, or if it turns out that autonomous vehicles make it attractive to live in Rochester and people leave New York. What Rochester's thinking about is, we're in a fight to the death with Syracuse, Albany, Schenectady, Troy, Skaneateles, Cooperstown, all these other places. Because they aren't needed. These are places that existed 100 years ago, and if we were starting from scratch, you wouldn't have all these little cities. Or if you were a farmer, you would call. If you were a corporation, you would call. That's not what we do with human beings. So at Rochester, they're thinking, we're trying to beat these other guys, and we're going to ally with Buffalo, so we'll have 1 million people who are in an area with plenty of electricity, plenty of water, interesting recreation, if you don't mind snow, and we'll try and compete that way. And Rochester actually has, I didn't know this until I went out there, a lot of businesses that followed the breakup of Bausch & Lomb and Eastman Kodak. So as those guys sort of fell apart, people stayed around. So there's several hundreds, if not thousands, of 10 to 30 person businesses in photonics and optics and things like that, because it was a hub for that expertise. And those people like living there, and they'd really rather not move to Phoenix. So all those little towns in upstate are busy trying to compete against each other, so they're the winner in those industries. And they happen to have a hand of cards around photonics and handling light, basically.
Isn't that part of the problem in that region, though?
Now, wait a minute. I'm a teacher. You have to raise your hand.
One of my grad students who actually wrote his thesis on creating and structuring innovation ecosystem in the upstate New York area.
Yeah.
And as we sort of peeled apart what the issue was, it was a whole variety of subscale competing initiatives. And the picture you paint of these towns fighting with each other, Schenectady was so busy pissing on Troy, was so busy pissing on Rochester, was so busy pissing on Buffalo, that they actually invested, relatively speaking, more effort in doing down other people's innovation than doing it collaboratively. So you end up with a set of communities where the inter-distance commute is typically the order of 14 to 20 minutes. So geographically, in time terms, as close together as the Boston ecosystem, and totally fragmented, right? And literally setting up things like, if you apply for this program, you are specifically enjoined not to be allowed to apply for the programs in any of the other cities.
So let me. So this is an affirmation of what the comment about Rochester before, and I should wrap. But the hope for tech type advance. There's 3 answers. One answer would be we just need better leadership, and Governor Cuomo is going to have half of these places thrive and half of them go away. Governor Cuomo is not going to do that. The second is some business will decide not to invest. And the third is that somebody will be able to count the cumulative benefit or track the ways in which jobs and investment can work to the benefit of Schenectady, Troy, Albany, and the Tri-Cities, rather than have them fight each other. And from a sort of rational actor point of view, observe they're better off coordinating, then breaking up, which actually happened in northern Ohio. They realized all these little towns near Canton had all these different bus routes, and you had to get off your bus in the edge of Toledo to go to the next one. And they said, you know, we got to bring this kind of thing together. So that can be coordinated at one host better with technology.
All of us have seen the Jetsons, right? None of us got to see who actually lived on the planet. We all saw what happened above the planet with all this great technology and efficiency. What is the likelihood that we're actually facing a future where a very small percentage of the population will actually be able to take advantage of these efficiencies and these gains in automation versus them being applied to solve these problems in the emerging world?
You were here this morning for Jeremy Grantham? Well, how would you handicap that?
I don't know. I'd say that it's more likely than not likely in the next 10 years. I think if we get our act together, we probably could alter that in some way. But I think if you look at the trends, even just in cities, in very populated cities in Brazil, for instance, the wealthy fly in helicopters, and the poor and even the middle class sit in hours and hours and hours of traffic, and they can't work where they want to work, even if their skills allow them to work there, because it just takes too much time to get to those places.
Yeah, and it's easy to see how that system self-supports. So here we are on the global elite, and we may feel badly about whatever's going on, but if we can get our kid into MIT, we certainly will be part of that. And now there's so much reward to financial engineering compared to real engineering that the best and the brightest minds go into financial engineering, and there's sort of a winner-take-all kind of thing in the digital economy that Nicholas Negroponte talked about 20 years ago. And that's what one sees. So it kind of depends on whether you follow what Jeremy said around this is just unstable for society, and our self-interest will be to defeat Schumpeter's thought that capitalism will eat itself, or not. So Joe and Joe Fuller and my colleague Rebecca Henderson teaches a really popular class at Harvard Business School called Reimagining Capitalism, the gist of which is how can we use capitalism, big corporations, to keep the thing from just eating itself alive, so we can keep this kind of system going. And the idea that the business leaders have to lead that, or the tech leaders, because the politicians aren't going to figure it out.
Do you think government today works in a way that is aligned with how technology is changing?
No, but so I'll end with a quote from E.O. Wilson. So E.O. Wilson says that we have caveman appetites and comprehension, and medieval rules, and almost godlike powers, and we haven't figured out how to match those things. And I would say that's up to people in the Tech Council to try and figure out. So my job was to provoke you a little bit, and I hope you found that to be useful, and thank you for having me here this afternoon.